The motion picture industry began emerging in the late 1800s. Through innovations and invention, it's grown into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. Chapter 8 looks at the history and changes that have taken place to get it to the massive profit generator that it is today. And we're going to look at the changes that have happened through the years, and then, of course, the internet. Netflix, rentals, on demand have all really affected distribution and added to this idea of long tail media and niche markets. So let's start at the beginning with early movie technologies and how this industry was born and emerged into what it is today. It all began in the late 1800s with two guys, Etienne Jules Marais and Edward Muybridge, were the first photographers who recorded motion on film. They recorded a horse running to prove that all 4 feet left the ground when the horse galloped. And this experiment was completed with a set of 24 cameras that were set up on tripwires around a track. Thomas Edison became interested in the idea of moving pictures and employed workers to work on the problem, and he came up with the kinetoscope, which was first presented in 1893. Kinetoscope machines offered an individual peep show of recorded movement, and the films were approximately 30 seconds long and could be watched by one person at a time through this little eyepiece. So soon these machines were set up in parlors or arcades, and they charged a nickel, and these theaters became known as Nickelodeons. This was a popular form of entertainment during its time, until the next innovation came from the Lumière brothers. Auguste Marie and Louis Jean were French inventors that began working with Edison's idea, and they created a portable movie camera that could also project images. So this innovation began a transition of movies from an individual experience to a shared experience inside the movie theater. The earliest films just showed people, and they were just doing regular things like working or families or just people on the street. So storytelling came later. So storytelling in film began to emerge in the early 1900s. One of the first noted films was 1902's Trip to the Moon, which was made by a French filmmaker named Georges Méliès. But this early version of storytelling was pretty much just a play on a stage that was filmed. The modern version of storytelling in film, the structure, was born out of a film called The Great Train Robbery by Edwin S. Porter. The story was laid out. It included 12 separate scenes at different locations. It told a realistic story. This film was about 10 minutes long, and it established some of the basic conventions of storytelling in movies. This film was kind of frightening for people at the time because they thought that it was really dangerous to show people how to rob a train. I will put a link to this on Schoology, and we'll possibly watch it in class so you can see how this was the bare bones of storytelling within film and innovative for its time. D.W. Griffith was one of the biggest directors of the silent movie era. He was the first to create a feature-length film, which is just a film that runs more than 1 hour. And during his time, most films were about 25 minutes. So Griffith's most recognized film was 1915's Birth of a Nation, and it told a story of post-Civil War era Ku Klux Klan, and it was based on a book called The Klansman by Thomas Dixon. And this movie was very racist and depicted African Americans as beasts. It was a 3-hour-long movie that was extremely offensive, and it was heavily criticized. He then made the film Intolerance, for which he had to seek funding from outside sources. The film was longer than Birth of a Nation, and it came with an even bigger price tag of $500,000, which was completely unimaginable for the time. And the film was a complete financial failure. And Griffith lost all the money he made with Birth of a Nation. One of Griffith's biggest innovations in the movie industry was the idea of the movie star. So he kept a group of regular actors and used them in several movies. He found that people wanted to see certain actors and would pay to watch certain people in films. So the first recognized movie star's name was Florence Lawrence, and she was employed by Griffith. The studio system of Hollywood was like a factory process for creating movies. Everything in the process was controlled by the studio in a vertically integrated system. It started with writers and ended in distribution. Movie stars were employed by the studios like Paramount, MGM, and Warner Brothers, which were the biggies at the time. And the actors, the movie stars, were just another cog in the assembly line, which created a product. The studio would complete like a series of films, and sometimes to fill up a theater booking for an entire year. So they would take this package of films to theater owners, and this package system in movie making was known as block booking. The packages ranged from a series of different caliber films to 52 films, one for each week of the year. So block booking was a way for studio owners to make sure they got their films out to the public, and sometimes they would even purchase the theaters in order to increase their profits and make sure that their films were shown. Talking pictures began to emerge in the late 20s, first with synchronized soundtracks. Music and voices were recorded and played simultaneously with the film. These were dubbed talkies and became the preferred types of film throughout the 1930s because it was very, very difficult to at first create pictures and sound together because of the recording technology at the time and the amount of noise on movie sets, because the lights would sizzle, they were very hot, and they had these huge giant cameras on tracks. So at first a lot of talkies were kind of boring because of so many limitations on camera angles and noise, but as technology improved, so did the films. And this technology lent itself to animation, and Walt Disney soon started utilizing that to add music and sound effects in cartoons. The studio system was pretty oppressive to actors and writers, and there was profit-minded people running the show. So in 1919, a group of performers, including Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, joined together to break away from the system with an independent movie-producing company called United Artists. United Artists did not use this factory model like the others. They didn't make the films, they distributed them, and they helped finance them, and the company stayed viable until 1981, and it was the basis of our modern studio system. The company produced an extremely expensive and unsuccessful film called Heaven's Gate, which nearly bankrupted them, and they were pretty much forced to merge with MGM. The studio system began to come to an end in 1938 when the U.S. Department of Justice looked at the vertical integration happening and deemed studios to be a monopoly. So the courts set out to end block booking and discriminatory practices between movie companies and theaters and allow independent films to have a chance to prosper. So the Hollywood antitrust case made it so studios could no longer block book more than 5 movies per year. And then in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that the studios could no longer own distribution points or theaters, which officially broke up the system, and this was known as the Paramount decision. Another interesting turn of events in the movie industry was following World War II and the blacklist. The blacklist was this dark cloud over Hollywood for about a decade. The House of Un-American Activities sought out and listed the names of actors and writers and other Hollywood folks that were suspected of spreading communism or being sympathizers or having ties to communism at all. So in 1947, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which included Richard Nixon, J. Parnell Thomas, and Joseph McCarthy, they got together, and it was basically a communist witch hunt, and it's also called McCarthyism. So they began to hold hearings on possible communist influences in Hollywood, and the Hollywood 10 were a group of 10 writers and directors that were the first to be singled out as possible unfriendly communists, and all 10 of them were asked Are you now, or have you ever been, a communist? Each of them refused to answer and were deemed in contempt of court, jailed, and subsequently blacklisted in Hollywood, which banned them from working in the film industry. By 1953, about 324 people had been blacklisted, and it included prominent figures like Charlie Chaplin, Lucille Ball, Gregory Peck, and many, many, many more. The blacklisting continued until 1960, when Dalton Trumbo, a member of the Hollywood 10, was hired and given screen credits for Spartacus and Exodus. But only about 10% of the people that were on the blacklist ever regained their careers. And I have a short video about the blacklist that I will put on Schoology. So, despite the second Red Scare, movies were very popular, reaching their peak in 1946 with 80 million tickets sold per week. It was one of the most popular forms of entertainment, and then television came in and began to take a bite out of ticket sales around 1948. And by 1953, movie ticket sales had dropped to almost half, with a large portion of the population sitting at home around the boob tube. So the film industry was forced to innovate and attempted to make larger-than-life movies, epics with color. TV was in black and white, and movie companies had color capabilities since the 20s, and they used it to entice audiences away from TV, and then 3D and bigger screens, and then the multiplex, which was one box office collecting revenue on several movies at a time, and they had fancy seats and fancy buildings. They were trying to turn going to the movies into an experience that was different than sitting at home in front of the TV. With this desire to turn movies into an experience that would draw people out of their homes, the blockbuster film was created. In 1975, Steven Spielberg gets credit for the first summer blockbuster, Jaws, which was the highest grossing movie at the time. It went to 200 million, and before 1975, most big movies were released around Christmas time. So this was the beginning of the summer blockbuster series. After the success of Jaws, a string of big-budget films were released, including Indiana Jones and the Star Wars trilogy, and then, later on Spider-Man, Pirates of the Caribbean. They all kind of fall into this summer blockbuster category. Avatar was one of the most commercially successful movies in history. It was, of course, a 3D sci-fi film, and it had the biggest box office, but not the biggest audience in history. Gone with the Wind has the honor of the most viewed movie. It has sold over 100 million movie tickets since 1939. And then in the 90s, we had video rentals and VCRs that started taking a chunk out of ticket sales with, and now, of course, DVDs, Netflix, Redbox. Then we moved on to digital production and projection. Computers started entering the scene and changing the way that production was done. In 1977, Star Wars was the first movie to have computer-controlled cameras to help make the movie. And then in 2004, Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow became the first major film that had all digital sets. They were all created on computers. And then 2007 was the first time digital sets were used in a movie, and it was actually successful. And then in 2009 and 2010, we've had this resurgence of 3D digital projection, 3D television. High definition is kind of coming into play as well. So what makes a movie profitable? You can either make a big budget film with a lot of marketing tie-ins and things to sell that relate to the movie, and that sells a lot of tickets, or, and this is in that short head that we talked about, or you can make a movie with a small budget, clear target audience, have a modest box office, and make a good return on your investment. So there's two ways. This is kind of that long tail. You got to find your niche target audience and understand that you're probably not going to have, blockbuster sales at the box office, but try not to spend that much money, and then you can have a good return on your investment and your time. Movies like Little Miss Sunshine, Paranormal Activity, The Blair Witch Project are good examples of successful small budget films. Here are some general revenue sources for movies. Box office sales, international distribution rights, rights to play it on pay-per-view, cable channel rights, the right to play it on network television costs money, home video rentals, rights to the book, toys and clothes, and then of course they make a lot of money through product placement within the movies themselves, which is a really growing form of advertisement because we don't watch advertisements anymore, they just put them right inside the media. And that long tail, movies do a lot of online promotion these days, and then we have, of course, Netflix and other online-based distribution systems like Hulu, Netflix, any place where you can watch movies. And then we have a wide availability of really obscure films from a wide variety of creators. So you could create a movie and put it online and maybe sell it. All right. That's all I have for you for Chapter 8. Have a great day. Here are your study guide questions for Chapter 8. What was the order of the series of innovations that led to the creation of movies? Go ahead and start with Edward Muybridge and Etienne Marie. What was the studio system, and what was one of the earliest rebellions against it? How did it finally end? Who led the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and what was their mission, and the impact of this committee?